Ja, de senaste månaderna har negativa nyheter om Kinas ekonomi duggat tätt och flera aktörer har sänkt sina tillväxtprognoser för landet. Med oss för att prata mer om det här så har vi DNBs Kina-expert Chen. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you. So almost every day here we get these gloomy reports from China, especially on the Chinese property market. So in short, what has happened in China?
What we're seeing here now is a confidence of crisis in the Chinese housing market, where the demand side, so the demand for purchasing houses, has really collapsed. And that is a crisis that is very difficult for the government to resolve. They have been trying to support the sector over the past year without really being successful at that.
You brought this graph that we have with us. So what does this mean? What does it show and what does it mean?
Yeah. So there are two things in this graph. It shows in part the electricity demand from China as a proxy for economic activity. That's a dark green line. And it also shows you what is happening with the housing market. And what we're seeing here is that the housing starts is actually collapsing to a level that we haven't seen since the depth of the financial crisis. This is a level that is not sustainable, but it is also a level that we believe is going to be very damaging for the economy in the period ahead, because the housing starts is really a leading indicator, whereas the electricity demand is showing you what's happening in the economy right here and now.
You talked about the stimulus in China, and we read today that China eases home purchase rules to boost the economy and make it easier for mainly first-time buyers to purchase homes. Is this a good thing, or could it snowball into worse macroeconomics in China?
Yeah, what we're seeing here is another type of measure that tries not only to target the first-time homebuyers, but also what I would call speculators in the market, the people that buy a second, a third, or fourth home for the purposes of investment. And what happened today is that they're trying to allow home buyers that already own previous properties to qualify for a lot of the subsidized rates, the subsidized costs, the lower taxes, the lower fees that first-time home buyers have. So the big change now is that people that have fully repaid their mortgages, despite owning more than one home, will also be classified as first-time home buyers. And that is something that is very interesting because it shows you that the government is trying to reignite the speculative demand as well. We don't think that is going to be successful. And there are a couple of reasons for that, primarily because we think there's a lot of counterparty risk that is difficult to resolve for the government.
All right, but do you think we will see more of these type of stimulating measures in China?
Definitely. I think that as the housing market remains at current levels in terms of new activity starts, we should see more and more support measures coming from the government. The problem is that they're not going to be very successful unless they are able to address some of the fundamental issues here. What we think is happening now is that housing is being supported. It's not being used as a stimulus measure. So a lot of people might think back to 2008 in the post-financial crisis era when China issued actually a lot of stimulus that brought about a lot of demand for commodities. What we're seeing now is that although stimulus is coming, it's there to mitigate the decline. It's not there to generate a new boom.
All right. So what do you think has the main focus for Xi Jinping, has that changed, or is it still focused on growth?
Yeah, I think for me, the big change that happened last year when China abruptly removed its zero COVID policy was a prioritizing of economic growth, a prioritizing of lifting the standards of living of the middle class. And I think that what we're seeing here is a continuation of that, but a realization that in order to deliver this, you cannot simply put more resources into the housing sector. It's not um, over the long term, it's not a sustainable way of generating growth for the middle class.
So in all, like on a global scale, how much does the development in China affect the global economy?
I would say that China is a source of supply. It's a source generally of supply. When we see crisis happening in China in the real estate sector, what is going to be impacted the most on the demand side is commodities. And that means that you're removing a lot of the upside potential from these commodities prices when the Chinese demand is low.
All right. So if I understand you correctly, it will be it's a risk. There are more risks in China still.
Definitely. And as I mentioned before, I think the big issue is the crisis of confidence. If you look at the big developers, the real estate developers in China, um, almost half of them are not making enough earnings to cover their interest expense. That is something that is very difficult for the government to resolve overnight. And the risk is that more and more developers will fall into a state of default, which is just going to perpetuate this crisis of confidence.
So what do you think needs to be done or to turn this development in China, and when could it be done?
Yes, I think the most important part for the government now is to issue quite forceful demand side measures. That means that they have to go in and actually generate demand for housing. That means putting in place a lot of shantytown redevelopments, a lot of urban projects that they themselves finance. So far, we haven't seen a major turnaround in that, but hopefully over the course of the coming months and quarters, that will help alleviate the earning situation for the developers.
Interesting. Thank you, Kelly, for being with us today.